All right, time for this week's installment of The Training of an American, Chapter 1, Part 3. Anyone who sees Carrie today will have a false idea of Walter Page's childhood home. A scrambling village has been built around the railroad station, destroying the early beauty of the spot. 70 years ago, the place did not even have a name. It was popularly described as Page's. The first house was a rough two-story building. When he became more prosperous, Walter's father built, in front of this, a two-story frame dwelling connecting it with the original structure, the rooms of which were needed for the growing family. A veranda, a well-kept fence, a flower-lined pathway, jonquils and irises in abundance added grace to the establishment. The house sat on a gently rising hill in the midst of a great grove of oak trees. In the rear stretched for miles the ever-beckoning forest. A country road skirted the front of the yard, and a short distance beyond this ran the railway. For several years, this remained the only habitation of the region. It was far neater and more pretentious than most rural houses in the South. Frank Page kept his place carefully painted and the numerous outbuildings in good repair. Life there was pleasant. The sky was intense in its blue, the grass and leaves in their green. The wildflowers were unusually animated. However, except for an occasional wagon lumbering by or a wheezy train crawling out of the forest and vanishing into it again, the general feeling was that of solitude, and that eternal rustling of the pines. How deeply these everlasting trees entered into Page's life became evident in those ambassadorial days in England, when the dying man, worn by his 5 years' vigil, turned his face from the battlefields of France and again looked longingly westward across the Atlantic. His one desire merely again to see and whiff the pine woods of this boyhood home. Those interested in tracing the influence of early associations on character can profitably linger over the first 5 years of Page's life. Afterward, his activities and the writings possessed in virility that startled and even shocked, yet all this time a trait that was just as conspicuous was gentleness. It is perhaps not fanciful to trace something of this quality to those early years at Page's. His father frequently took long trips on business. For 4 years there was no other baby. There were few neighbors, and Walter and his mother for weeks and months at a time lived alone. And it was an existence not without its idyllic aspect. Walter's mother was little more than a girl, in the early and middle 20s. Walter himself was an attractive child, his eyes a deep brown, his hair a mass of brown curls, his interest always keen, his intelligence always active. His mother loved the out-of-doors, and flowers and birds and long walks in the woods thus became daily recreations. There was fishing, too, a few brooks and wily Balcomb's Pond. And there was also much reading. There were no schools in the vicinity at this time, so in addition to her other duties, Walter's mother became schoolmistress with the small boy as her solitary pupil. Page never saw a schoolroom until he was 10 years old. His mother taught him to read, write, and cipher, and also gave him, thus early, his introduction to Scott and Dickens. One thinks of Mark Hopkins' definition of a college as a log with a teacher at one end and a student at the other, and there is perhaps another advantage, at least in the development of the quieter emotions, when this teacher is the mother and the pupil an only child. For the sessions were frequently held out of doors, on the little knock back of the house, on the little knoll at the back of the house, or better still, by the old company mill on Crabtree Creek. This latter spot was one of Walter's favorite haunts, then and afterward. It was built as far back as 1810, and for 2 generations the farmers had brought their grain and corn there for grinding. A clear stream burst over the dam, part of it flowing over the mill wheel of the beautiful overshot variety. But merely watching this process and the turning of the stones was only part of the charm. The real attraction was the creek itself, the walks along its banks, the trees and the flowers that bordered it, the deep forests that stretch along either side. Beech, oak, sycamore. A pine grew so profusely that in summer they almost arched the stream. In spring, too, the banks were a mass of rhododendron, maidenhair fern, arbutus, an ideal spot for a kindergarten and primary school. That love of nature which proved such a solace to Page's mature life was thus an inheritance of his childhood. For all these things, as well as fishing, boating, and swimming, became as much part of his education as the McGuffey readers in which he first learned to spell his way. And there's a picture here, the old company mill on Crabtree Creek near Cary, one of the favorite rambling places of Page as a child. Let's see if we can... I wonder if that's still standing today. Interesting to find out. So far as Walter could observe, human existence was a tranquil process. But the times themselves were far from tranquil. His first 5 years represented one of the most agitated eras in American history. It was the time of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Kansas-Nebraska discussions, the rise of the Republican Party, Lincoln-Douglas debates, the performances of John Brown, of the many attempts to compromise a subject that could not be compromised. With all these attempts, however, North Carolina, especially the part in which the Pages lived, was sympathetic. Though the state had been one of the last to ratify the Constitution, refusing to do so indeed until the first 10 amendments were added, its devotion to that document and the Union was strong. It looked coldly upon the opinion of its sister state, South Carolina, that the mere election of Abraham Lincoln was a sufficient provocation for the secession of the South. Probably a majority of North Carolinians disapproved the act of the Cotton States in withdrawing from the Union and forming the Confederate government at Montgomery, Alabama. At first, the people refused even to call a convention to discuss the question of secession. The leading men in the state strongly opposed such radical action. Not until President Lincoln issued his call for troops and demanded from North Carolina its proportion did the situation change. It wished to remain in the Union, but could not bring itself to take up arms against its neighbor states. Like Virginia, therefore, North Carolina reluctantly cast its lot with the Confederacy. But a considerable minority of North Carolinians, even under these circumstances, regarded the step as a terrible one. To this group, Frank Page naturally belonged. All through the war, he never concealed his opinion that it was a mistake. Yet his attitude was not ungenerous or carping, or lacking in complete sympathy for the Southern predicament. Moreover, these Southerners were his friends. His family had lived in the South for many generations. They were his own people, and he loved and admired them. He therefore offered himself and his resources to the Confederacy, always trusting that the difficulty would be solved in some way that would not mean a permanent disruption of the Union. He kept his lumber mill going day and night, devoting the entire product to the Confederate government. Loyally as Frank Page served what had now become his country, he never had the slightest doubt that the North would win. In the first place, it was right, Secondly, it was powerful, while the South was weak in the resources that meant success in war. The settlement around the Page house was growing. Walter's father had 3 sawmills. Several other families had moved in, making necessary the construction of more houses. To Walter's solitary existence, playmates were now added. His memory mainly associated with the war period. However, not the boys and girls of the white families, but a little Negro called Tance. Most Southerners, when children had such Negro companions, would combine the functions of playmate, protector, and instructor in the lore of boyhood. This character was a kind of Southern substitute for the pedagogos of the Greeks. He was old enough to protect his charge from the attacks of bigger boys. He could also guide him through the woods, take him fishing, purvey all kinds of local gossip, sometimes terrorize him with ghost stories and Negro folk tales. Tance and Walter now held many whispered conversations about a vague and distant phenomenon known as the war. It was in some way associated with drum and fife, with a new flag, and raw recruits drilling in fields with a strange breed of monster called Yankees, with patient women sewing stockings and making bandages, with prayers in Ashbury Church up the road for victory against the enemy, with the tears of mothers as bad news came from the front, with the arguments of Frank Page about the cruel sacrifice of men in a hopeless cause, and even more poignantly, with a coffin that was occasionally lifted off the train at the station right at the foot of the Page house. In spite of these convincing reminders, the whole thing seemed unreal as one of the Waverley novels which Walter's mother used to read to him. In Page's recollection, the war in its length seemed almost a lifetime. There were periods of exultation, bell ringing, prayers, and thanksgiving in the little church, followed by times of deep depression. Finally came frenzied reports of fire and slaughter approaching the Page home. Tance brought stories he had heard of an ogre named Sherman, who, after laying waste great areas of Georgia and South Carolina, burning cotton, destroying cities, ripping up railroad tracks, murdering men, women, Negroes, everybody in his path, had struck the soil of North Carolina and was rapidly advancing in their direction. Day after day, the episodes became more harrowing. And there was other, even more disquieting news, that the South was breaking. That Grant was rapidly closing in on Lee in Virginia. Even incredible and malicious fabrication that Lee had surrendered. Now Sherman had reached Fayetteville and destroyed the Southern arsenal in that town. Hard on its heels came the news that Raleigh, only 8 miles away, had surrendered and was being patrolled by Federal troops. And then the thing became a reality indeed. One morning, Walter and Tance saw cavalrymen coming rapidly along the road. Apparently in flight, their uniforms were not blue, but gray. They were General Joe Wheeler's sorely pressed Confederates fleeing from the advancing Federals. They even witnessed a cavalry skirmish, an engagement that represented perhaps the last fighting of the war. Then, after a brief period, came the blue-coated soldiers of Sherman in pursuit. And what a vast and endless host! Walter, his brother Robert, and Tance stood at a second-story window and watched for a whole day, while the Federal Army, infantry, cavalry, artillery rattled by. Its size astounded and overwhelmed them. They did not know that this procession was merely one column of Sherman's army, and that Sherman's army itself was only one of the mighty hosts that Lincoln had called into being to crush the Southern Confederacy. They were naturally frightened, especially as Walter's father was away from the house. Their fears were not allayed, however, when a grave-looking man in a general's uniform came up to Walter's mother, saluted, and said that he should need the Page house for his own use. This was Horatio Seymour, afterward Democratic candidate for president, and a mile or two away at the Jones House, another future Democratic candidate for the presidency. General Winfield Scott Hancock took up his headquarters. General Seymour occupied one of the lower rooms, leaving the rest of the house for the Page family. While his officers pitched their tents in the front yard amid the oak trees. Here, Seymour stayed for 3 weeks, but the visit did not prove unpleasant for the Page family, and has left no bitterness. The burning of the campfires at night rather appealed to Walter's romantic instinct, and the behavior of the army did not substantiate the dreadful stories that had preceded it. Yet, there was one instance, an intense moment, Walter Page never forgot. One morning, a federal courier came up to his mother, who was sitting on the porch. "Good morning, madam," he said. "You people certainly have played hell with us now." She was a little shocked at the language, but still more so at the message. "President Lincoln has been shot." That's the end of part 3. Till next time.